Miss Vane?
You're not Jesse McCord. I'm Garrett. Jesse was my brother.
Was?
Jesse died 10 days ago. You can take the train back east.
No, Cowboy. I came here for a new life, and I'm not crawling back.
A broken woman, a dead man's contract, and 3 brothers who swore they needed no one until she walked through their door. Follow along so you don't miss what happens next. The train screamed before it stopped. That whistle cut across the Colorado plains like something in pain, bouncing off frozen ridgelines and dying in the gray sky above Stonewater. Evangeline Vane heard it and felt nothing. She had been sitting upright for 11 hours, braced against the wooden seat, her spine straight from necessity rather than manners. The leather and steel beneath her gown didn't allow for slouching. She pressed 2 fingers to the fogged glass and looked out. White, all of it white, and cold in a way that Boston never managed a dry, biting cold that didn't seep through your coat, so much as simply decide to live inside your bones. The mountains beyond the depot were enormous. She hadn't expected that. She had read about the Rockies in a pamphlet, seen a sketch once in a newspaper, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer indifference of them. They did not care that she had come. They did not care that she was frightened. That was, she thought, something they had in common. The platform was nearly empty. A man in a buffalo hide coat stood apart from the small cluster of locals, arms crossed, hat brim dusted with snow. He wasn't looking at the train. He was looking at the ground just in front of it, the way a person looks when they are rehearsing something difficult. Eva gathered her carpet bag. She stood carefully, shifting her weight the way Lucian's predecessor, a Boston physician who had charged too much and cared too little, had taught her. Left foot first, hand on the seat back. Let the brace take the load before the leg does. She made it down the 3 iron steps without incident. The cold hit her face like an open palm. She walked toward the man in the buffalo coat. Each step landed with purpose. The brace creaked faintly beneath the layers of wool and cotton, but only she could hear it, and she had long since stopped flinching at the sound. He looked up when she was 10 feet away. He was not what she had imagined Jesse McCord to look like. This man was older mid-30s, maybe with a jaw like quarried stone and eyes the color of January river water, cold and clear, and measuring along his left temple, thin and old, gone silver at the edges. A soldier's mark. She recognized it from the veterans, who begged near the dock's back. Home. Miss Vane, he said. Not a question. That's right. She stopped in front of him. And you're not Jesse McCord. Something moved across his face. Not quite pain, but the echo of it. The place where pain had been so long it had worn a groove. No, he said, I'm Garrett, his brother. He pulled his hat from his head. Ma'am, I need to tell you something before we go any further, and I'd ask you to hear me out before you decide anything. Eva set her carpet bag down in the snow. She folded her hands at her waist. Then say it. He said it plainly. That was the one mercy he gave her. No circling, softening, no searching for the words that would make it land easier. Jesse McCord had died 10 days prior. A shaft collapse at the East Cut. They had pulled him out on the 2nd day, but by then it was already too late. He was 22 years old, and he had written to a bride broker in Boston because he believed a good woman and a solid claim could build something worth leaving behind. He had been right about the claim. Eva stood very still. She had not loved Jesse McCord. She had never met Jesse McCord, but she had read his letters 4 times each, had studied his handwriting, had noted the way he crossed his 7s like a European, and always signed his name with an extra loop on the G. She had built a version of him in her mind, careful and kind, and far enough from Boston that her history wouldn't follow her there. That version was gone now. I'm sorry, Garrett said. He meant it. She could tell because he didn't say anything after it. She looked past him at the mountains. The wind moved through the gap between 2 peaks, and she watched the snow lift off the ridgeline and dissolve into the gray. Then she picked up her carpet bag. What happens to the contract? She asked. Garrett blinked. Miss Vane, the broker's agreement. room and board for 6 months in exchange for domestic labor and the possibility of marriage. She looked back at him. Jesse is gone, so the marriage is off the table. I understand that, but the contract had 2 parts. He stared at her. I'm not going back to Boston, she said. Not loudly. She didn't need volume. I have $11.40, a carpet bag, and a return train that leaves in 3 days. If I get on it, I will arrive at a city where I have no employment, no lodging, and a reputation that precedes me like a bad smell. She shifted the bag to her other hand. I am not asking for charity, Mr. McCord. I am asking for what was promised, 6 months of honest work. I will cook, clean men, manage your stores, keep your ledgers, whatever needs doing. At the end of it, I'll leave on my own terms, with enough saved to start somewhere new. The wind came through between the buildings and rattled the depot sign above them. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. You know what people will say, he said finally. A woman living with 3 men and no husband. People said I was broken goods when I walked with a limp. People said I was a disgrace when my engagement ended. People have been saying things about me since I was 19 years old, and I am still standing in the snow in Colorado. So you'll forgive me if I've stopped letting their opinions dictate my geography. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but it came close. There are 3 of us, he said. Jethro won't like it. Then Jethro can take it up with me directly. Garrett put his hat back on. He reached down and took her carpet bag from her hand before she could protest. And she let him, because the walk to the wagon was longer than the walk from the train, and she had learned to choose her battles wisely. 6 months, he said. We honor the room and board. You work, we provide. At the end of it, you're free to go wherever you choose, and we'll put together what we can to help you get there. That's all I'm asking. They walked side by side toward the wagon at the edge of the platform. The horse was a big gray mare, patient and frost-dusted, already pointed toward the mountains. Eva climbed up onto the bench without help. It took effort and it took concentration. And there was one bad moment when her hip caught, and she felt the familiar white-hot flicker along the scar line. But she made it. She sat straight, and she breathed, and she looked at the mountains. Garrett climbed up beside her, gathered the reins, and clicked his tongue at the mare. The wagon moved. Behind them, the train whistles screamed again, departing now, heading back east toward everything she had survived and nothing she intended to return to. Eva did not watch it go. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, on the narrow track that cut through the snow toward Iron Ridge and the frozen unknown beyond it. A woman's worth isn't measured by whether she can bear an heir for a man. She had told herself that in the dark of many bad nights, it is forged by her own 2 hands and her will to stand. Her hands were cold inside her wool gloves. She pressed them together in her lap and held on. The mountains grew larger as they rode into them, enormous and indifferent and ancient. And for the first time in a very long while, Evangeline Vane felt something that was not quite hope but was pointed in that direction, the raw and stubborn sense that she had not yet reached the end of her own story. She intended to write the rest of it herself. The cabin sat at the base of Iron Ridge, like something the mountain had coughed up and forgotten about. Eva saw it from half a mile out and said nothing. She had learned, in the last several hours of riding beside Garrett McCord, that silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was simply the natural state of 2 people who had both run out of easy things to say. The place was standing. That much could be said for it. 2 stories of rough-hewn pine gone dark with age, a stone chimney bleeding a thin thread of smoke into the pewter sky, a barn off to the left that leaned slightly eastward, as though it were listening for something. The fence rails were split in 2 places. A shutter hung by one hinge on the upper window. The front porch had a board missing, 3rd from the steps. She cataloged all of it the way a person does when they are deciding whether something is worth saving. She decided it was. Garrett pulled the mare to a stop in the yard and climbed down. He came around to her side without being asked. Not hovering, but simply present, close enough to catch her if the step gave her trouble. She appreciated that he didn't make a production of it. He just stood there and let her do what she could do on her own. She made it down. The cabin door swung open before they reached the porch. The man who filled the doorframe was not Garrett's size, but he moved like he was. He had the same dark hair, the same broad shoulders, but where Garrett's face was contained and careful, this one was open in its hostility. Sharp eyes, a jaw set hard, and a rifle held loose at his side, with the barrel pointed at the ground, which was the only reason Eva didn't step backward. "Who's this?" he said. Not asking. Stating, "Jethro." Garrett's voice carried a warning in it. "I know who she is." Jethro's eyes moved over Eva with the flat assessment of a man who had learned to read threats quickly and trusted that skill above most others. "I'm asking what she's doing here." "She's staying." Garrett set her carpetbag on the porch step. 6 months. We honor the contract. Jesse's dead. I'm aware. The contract died with him. Eva took one step forward. The room and board portion of the agreement had nothing to do with Jesse being alive. It had to do with labor exchanged for lodging. She looked at Jethro steadily. The rifle didn't move. Neither did she. "I'm not here to mourn a man I never met, and I'm not here to take anything that isn't offered. I'm here to work." Jethro stared at her. Behind him, quieter, a third figure appeared in the doorway, younger than the other two by several years, with watchful brown eyes and a stillness that was different from Garrett's. Where Garrett's stillness was the stillness of a man, holding himself in check, this one was simply at rest, observing. He looked at Eva, and then at her posture, and then, very briefly, at the way she was standing, the slight favoring of her left side, the careful distribution of weight. "Come inside," Lucian said. "It's cold." Jethro didn't move from the doorway. Garrett put a hand briefly on his brother's shoulder as he passed. Something passed between them, an old shorthand, years deep, and Jethro stepped aside. He didn't look happy about it, but he stepped aside. Eva walked in. The interior was worse than the exterior. Not filthy. Exactly, but profoundly neglected. The kind of neglect that comes from 3 men in grief, from people who have stopped seeing their surroundings because they have stopped caring about them. Ash piled in the hearth, dishes stacked unwashed, a coat thrown over the back of a chair that had been there long enough to develop its own gravity. The table had maps and papers spread across it, weighted down with a coffee tin and a hunting knife. Jesse's chair, she noticed, was pushed slightly back from the table, at an angle, as though he had just stood up and would be back in a moment. Nobody had straightened it. She set her gloves on the windowsill and looked around. "Is there an apron?" she asked. Lucian found her one. It was a man's apron, enormous on her frame, but she tied it twice around her waist and started with the hearth. She worked for 4 hours. Garrett came in and out, bringing wood, checking the stores. Lucian disappeared to the back room and returned periodically to watch her with that quiet, assessing look. Jethro sat by the window with a cleaning rag and his rifle and said nothing to anyone. But Eva noticed that his eyes tracked her progress around the room and that each time she moved to a new task, the hostility in his posture decreased by some small measurable degree. She scrubbed the table. She organized the papers, without reading them, stacking them neatly, leaving the knife and the tin where they were. She heated water and washed the dishes and found a broom and swept ash from the hearth out into the cold yard. She found a crock of dried beans and a heel of salt pork and put them on to soak. By the time the light outside went gray-blue with early dark, the cabin smelled like wood smoke and something edible, and the floor was 3 shades lighter than it had been. Jethro came to the table for supper and ate without complaint. That, Eva decided, was probably the closest thing to a compliment she was going to get from him for a while, and she was content with that. She was given Jesse's former room. Garrett carried her bag up without being asked. The room was small, a cot, a washstand, a single window that looked out toward the mountain, and it had been cleared of Jesse's belongings, but recently. and not entirely. There was still an indent in the mattress, a nail on the wall where something had hung. She washed her face. She took off her boots. She sat on the edge of the cot and reached beneath her gown to check the brace. The left panel had shifted during the wagon ride. It happened sometimes. The steel bracket that ran from her hip to just above the knee would work loose from its leather housing if she sat unevenly for too long. And when it did, the edge of it ground against the scar tissue below her hip bone. It had been grinding since late afternoon. She had been ignoring it because she had other things to do. She reached for the buckle. Her fingers found it, worked it loose, and she felt the brace shift. And then the panel slipped inward, and the jagged metal edge dragged hard against the inflamed scar. And she made a sound she hadn't meant to make. Sharp and involuntary, bitten off almost immediately, but the cabin walls were thin. Boots on the stairs. Fast. The door opened. Lucien, with a lantern. Garrett right behind him. She heard Jethro stop on the landing. "I'm fine," she said immediately. Lucien came into the room without hesitation, not rushing, not panicking, moving with the deliberate calm of a man who had seen people in pain before and knew that stillness helped more than urgency. He set the lantern on the washstand and looked at her, where he said, "Hip brace." The panel shifted. She was breathing carefully. One hand pressed flat against her hip through the wool. "The edge is caught on the scar. If I can just—" "Don't." He was already beside her, lowering himself to one knee. "Let me see it." She hesitated. A year of hiding the brace, of dressing and undressing alone, of navigating physicians' offices with her jaw clenched and her dignity assembled around her like armor. Garrett spoke from the doorway, quiet and even. "We're not going to make it worse." She moved her hands away. Lucien worked carefully. He found the buckles by feel, assessing the mechanism with his fingertips before he touched anything else. He called over his shoulder for his medical shears, and Jethro, still on the landing, passed them through the gap in the door without a word. She felt the shears begin to work on the leather housing that had seized around the bracket. Then the panel shifted again, and the edge caught, and she felt the tear of metal against raw skin. And she couldn't stop it this time. A sharp, ragged cry tore out of her, involuntary and humiliating, her back arching away from the pain. "Easy." Garrett crossed the room and crouched in front of her, taking her hands in both of his. His grip was firm without being crushing. "Something to hold on to. Look at me. Right here." She looked at him. January River eyes. Steady. Jethro appeared in the doorway, lantern light catching the hard line of his jaw. He came in and held the lamp higher without being asked, angling the light toward Lucien's hands, giving him what he needed to see. Nobody spoke. Lucien worked the shears through the last of the leather housing and eased the metal panel away from her hip, and Eva exhaled long and slow and closed her eyes. "The scar tissue is inflamed." Lucien's voice was matter-of-fact, clinical in a way that somehow made the vulnerability bearable. "The bracket has been sitting against the wound edge for hours. I have a salve that will help." He looked up at her. "This brace needs adjustment before you wear it again. The left panel has to be remounted at a wider angle, or this will keep happening." "I know," she said. "How long has it been doing this?" She opened her eyes. "Since Cincinnati." Garrett's hands tightened around hers, briefly, and then relaxed. Jethro said nothing. But he stayed in the doorway with the lantern held high, and he didn't leave until Lucien had finished. Applying the salve, and Eva had been helped to lie back against the cot, with the brace set aside, and a folded blanket tucked under her hip. Then he went back downstairs. She heard him, an hour later, moving around the kitchen. The sound of the coffee pot, the creak of the chair by the window. He did not go to bed for a long time. In the morning, Eva came downstairs to find a fresh-cut length of leather on the table, beside Lucien's medical shears and a small awl. Jethro was already outside. Garrett was at the fire. Lucien looked at the leather strip and then at Eva, and said quietly, "He was a cobbler's apprentice before the war. He knows leather work." Eva looked at the strip for a moment. Then she sat down, poured herself coffee, and got to work. She found it on a Tuesday. She had been working on Jesse's room, a proper cleaning this time, moving the cot, taking the washstand apart to scrub underneath it when she noticed the board. It was the third plank from the window, running east to west. The others were nailed firm. This one gave slightly under her foot, a soft give that didn't match the rest of the floor. She might have missed it if she hadn't been moving carefully, redistributing her weight as she always did, staying conscious of which boards would hold her. She crouched down, ran her fingers along the edge, found the gap. She lifted it with both hands. The tin box underneath was small, the size of a cigar box, roughly with a hinged lid gone rusty at the corners. She sat back on the floor and set it on her knee and opened it. Inside, a folded journal, leather-covered, well-used. And beneath the journal, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, a chisel. About 8 inches long, the handle worn smooth with use. The blade was snapped broken clean off, 3 inches from the head, the steel fracture bright and fresh. Looking even now, she opened the journal first. Jesse McCord had neat handwriting, small and precise, the penmanship of a man who had taught himself carefully and was proud of it. She read slowly, sitting on the floor of his old room, with the winter light coming pale through the window. The entries started last spring. Routine at first, assay reports, weather, notes on the silver vein's depth and direction. Then in late summer, a change in tone. Shorter entries, more urgent. August 14, found the east support beam notched at the base. Clean cuts, not weathering. Someone has been in the shaft. August 22. Bauer says he saw a man near the upper cut at night. Didn't recognize him. Wore a town coat, not work clothes. September 3. The beam at Section 4 has been compromised. I pulled a chisel head from the rock fall. Private forge mark on the collar stone and hammer. Initials M, S. This was not an accident. September 9. Going to Stonewater to file a report with the land office. If something happens to me, the box is under the floor. The last entry was dated September 11th. Jesse had died on October 4th. Eva sat with the journal in her lap and the chisel in her hand, and she looked at the forge mark on the broken collar, stone and hammer. Initials pressed clean and deliberate into the steel. The mark of a private forge, a professional's tool, made to order, traceable. She brought everything downstairs. Garrett was at the table with the maps. Lucian was in the back room. She didn't know where Jethro was, but she called out, and he answered from the barn. And she heard his boots on the frozen yard before she had finished spreading the journal open on the table. All three of them read it standing up. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Jethro said very quietly, "Stone, his forge mark." Eva set the chisel beside the journal. Jesse pulled this from the rockfall at Section 4. He knew the beams had been deliberately cut. Garrett's face had gone very still. That soldier's stillness, the kind that comes just before a decision rather than after. He was going to report it, Lucian said. He was looking at the September 9th entry, his finger hovering just above the page without touching it. He went to Stonewater 3 days before he died and filed nothing, Jethro said, because I checked after the collapse. I rode in, and I asked, and there was nothing in the land office under his name, because whoever he spoke to told Stone first. Eva looked at each of them in turn. Jesse knew. He hid this because he knew he might not make it, and he hid it somewhere a woman would find it. She paused. He was expecting me. The room was quiet except for the fire. It was Garrett who spoke first. "We take this to the federal marshal." The knock at the door was hard and businesslike. 3 sharp raps that didn't wait for an answer before the door swung open. The man who walked in wore a good coat and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never had a reason to doubt that doors would open for him. He was not Malachi Stone. She would learn Stone's face later. But he had the manner of a man in Stone's employ, which was a specific kind of manner, polished on the surface, rotten underneath. He looked around the cabin, taking inventory. "McCord property?" he said. "You're standing in it," Garrett said. The man reached into his coat and produced an envelope. which he placed on the table beside the journal, without appearing to notice what the journal was. Mr. Stone's office has reviewed the outstanding debt on the Iron Ridge claim, as registered under the late Jesse McCord. The balance owing is $400. He folded his hands. Payment is expected within 14 days. Failure to produce the sum will result in foreclosure proceedings and transfer of the land title to Mr. Stone's mining consortium. The silence in the room changed character entirely. Jethro moved. He came around the table fast, and he had 6 inches and 40 pounds on the courier, and he put himself between the man and the door before the man could do anything about it. His hand wasn't on his gun, but it was near it. "Get out," Jethro said. Eva stepped forward. She placed her hand on Jethro's arm, not grabbing. He looked down at her. "Don't," she said quietly. "That's what they want. We shoot the messenger, and Stone has justification for everything that comes next." Jethro's jaw was tight enough to crack. She's right. Garrett had moved to the other side of the table. He was looking at the courier with an expression that was perfectly civil and communicated nothing good. "You've delivered your message. You can leave." The courier adjusted his coat, nodded once, and walked out. They heard his horse leave at a trot. Eva picked up the envelope and opened it. She read it. Then she set it flat on the table beside the journal. "The debt doesn't exist," she said. "Jesse's letters mention nothing about a loan from Stone or anyone connected to him. There's no lien on record at the land office. Jethro just said so." She looked at the envelope, then at the journal. "This is a fabrication. A way to get the claim legally transferred before the murder charge can catch up to them." 14 days, Lucian said. 14 days to what? Jethro's voice was low and flat. "We don't have $400. We don't need $400. Eva pulled the journal toward her and turned to the September 3rd entry. "We need a federal marshal, not a Stonewater land officer, a federal marshal. Someone Stone can't buy. We go over Stone's head entirely." Garrett looked at her. "And while we're doing that," she continued, "we go up to the high cut, and we extract enough silver to demonstrate the claim's active value. A working claim is significantly harder to foreclose on than a dormant one, even with a fabricated debt." She tapped the journal. "Jesse documented everything. This is evidence of premeditated murder. Combined with the chisel and a mineral assay showing active production, we have the foundation of a federal case." Jethro stared at her. "You talk like a lawyer. I talk like a woman who grew up watching factory owners take everything from working people through paperwork." She met his eyes steadily. "They do it the same way every time. They use the law like a weapon when it suits them, and they ignore it when it doesn't. The only way to beat that is to use it first and use it better." The fire cracked in the hearth. Garrett picked up the chisel. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, looking at the forge mark. "Jesse brought this home for a reason," he said quietly. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular. He was just saying it out loud, the way a man does when he's trying to make a dead brother's last act mean something. He knew what it was. He knew what it proved. And now we do too. Eva closed the journal carefully and set it in the tin box with the chisel. "We don't throw the first punch. We build a case that makes theirs impossible to defend." She looked at each of them. "Stone is counting on grief to make you reckless. Don't give him what he's counting on." Jethro looked at her for a long time. Then he turned and went to the window and stood there with his arms crossed, looking out at the mountain. He didn't argue. That, Eva was learning, was how Jethro McCord said yes. Garrett set the chisel back in the tin and closed the lid. His hand rested on it for a moment. "We ride for the high cut in 2 days, he said. "Weather's clear through Thursday. I'll need paper and ink," Eva said. "I'm going to copy Jesse's entries in a second hand so we have a duplicate. If something happens to the original, we still have the record." Lucian was already moving toward the shelf, where the writing supplies were kept. Outside, the wind came off Iron Ridge and moved through the pine stands with a sound like breathing, slow and deep and old. The mountain had been here long before Malachi Stone, and it would be here long after. Eva could feel that in her bones, the same way she had felt the cold when she stepped off the train. She picked up the pen Lucian set before her and dipped it and began to write. They left before dawn. 4 horses, 4 bedrolls, enough provisions for 10 days. The wagon stayed behind the trail to the high cut, was too narrow and too steep for wheels. And the snow up there didn't allow for anything that couldn't pick its own footing. Eva rode a broad-chested bay mare named Cora that Lucian had selected for her without making a production of it. Sure-footed, he said. Steady temperament. Doesn't spook. She had been riding for 3 days now, and her hip knew about every one of them. But she kept that information to herself. The climb took most of the morning. The high cut opened up above the tree line, a wide granite shelf, blasted and worked into the mountainside over the better part of a decade, with the main shaft entrance boarded and a secondary drift cut running northeast along the silver vein. Jesse's assay markers were still in place, small iron stakes driven into the rock at intervals, flagged with red cloth gone stiff with frost. Eva pulled the ledger from her coat and started at the first stake. "What are you doing?" Jethro asked from behind her. "Reconstructing the assay record." She moved to the second stake. "Jesse's journal has production notes through September, but nothing after. We need a current inventory if we're going to demonstrate active working status to the marshal." He watched her for a moment. Then he went to the boarded shaft and started pulling planks. Garrett directed the work with the economy of a man who had organized men under fire. No wasted words, clear sequences, everything assigned before anyone asked. He and Jethro opened the secondary drift and went in with lanterns and hand tools, while Lucian set up the camp shelter on the lee side of the rock shelf where the wind broke. Eva sorted rock. It was not glamorous work. The ore they brought out came in chunks ranging from a man's fist to his head. Gray-white quartz shot through with the dull gleam of silver sulfide. She learned the difference in the first hour. High-grade ore had weight to it beyond its size, and the silver threads ran continuous rather than spotty. She built 2 piles. She kept meticulous notes. By noon, she had filled 4 pages of the ledger. Lucian brought her coffee without being asked and sat on a flat rock beside her pile with his own cup. Watching her work, "You've done assay work before," he said. "Factory inventory. Different material. Same principle." She turned a chunk of ore in her gloved hands, checking the vein pattern. "You learn to categorize quickly when your pay depends on the count being right." "Boston? Textile mill. Before that, a cannery." She set the rock in the high-grade pile. "I was good at the ledger work, so they moved me to inventory supervisor when I was 20. Better pay, worse hours. And then the factory collapse." She looked at him. He said it simply, without pity, and that made it easier to answer. "Structural failure in the east wing. 3 floors came down." She picked up another rock. 14 women died. I was lucky, depending on how you define the word." Lucian was quiet for a moment. "Lucky is defined by whether you're still here to argue about it." She almost smiled at that. "The salve I've been using on the scar," she said, changing direction slightly. "It's different from what the physician in Boston prescribed. It actually works. Comfrey and calendula in a beeswax base. Comfrey promotes tissue repair. It's been used for that since before anyone thought to write it down. The calendula reduces inflammation." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "The physician in Boston probably prescribed laudanum and bed rest." "Bed rest," he repeated, "dry and flat. For 6 weeks, which you didn't take." "I had rent to pay." He looked at the ledger in her lap, at the 4 pages of precise notation, at the organized piles of ore, and he didn't say anything else on the subject. But the look on his face said enough an acknowledgement, clear and steady, that what she had survived had not diminished her. It had simply shown what she was made of. She went back to sorting rock. Garrett came out of the drift at mid-afternoon with ore dust on his coat and a look on his face that was the closest thing to satisfied she had seen from him. He came to her pile first. "What's the count?" 43 pounds high grade, maybe 80 of secondary. She showed him the ledger. "The vein is running consistent northeast. If Jesse's earlier notes are right about the depth, you're looking at a significant deposit, enough to matter legally and financially. He studied her notation. He had the focused attention of a man who respected accurate information above sentiment, and he read her ledger entries the way another man might read a military dispatch, absorbing, cross-referencing, trusting the data. "This is good work," he said. "I know." He glanced up. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. He had expected her to deflect, she realized, to say something modest. He handed the ledger back with a nod. "We'll pull another load out before dark." He went back to the drift. That evening, around the campfire with the temperature dropping hard and the stars coming out sharp as broken glass above the peaks, Eva updated the ledger by firelight while the brothers ate. The work had a rhythm to it that she had missed without knowing she'd missed it, the satisfaction of a record that was accurate, a number that could be trusted, a document that could stand in a room and be believed. Jethro sat across the fire from her. He had been watching her on and off all day with that flat measuring look, and she had gotten accustomed to it. It wasn't hostile anymore, not exactly. It was more like the way he watched the tree line, constant, calibrated, looking for information. "You didn't flinch when I pulled the rifle on you," he said, out of nowhere. She looked up. "What?" "First night, I came to the door with the rifle, and you didn't step back. I was tired," she said, "and I'd come a long way. Most people step back. Most people haven't had a factory ceiling fall on them." She turned a page in the ledger. After that, a rifle pointed at the floor reads as cautious, not threatening. Jethro looked at the fire. "I had a sister," he said. It came out flat and factual, stripped of anything that would make it easier to hear. "Younger. The men who came through our county in '63, they weren't particular about who they hurt." A pause. "I wasn't home." Eva set the ledger down. She didn't say she was sorry. She had learned that sorry was often more about the speaker than the person it was aimed at. "You came home after," she said. "What was left of it? And you stayed." He looked up at her. The firelight moved across the hard angles of his face. "Garrett needed someone to watch his back," he said, "and he needed someone to watch yours." Jethro didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. And in the long silence between them, something was established. Not friendship yet, but recognition. Two people who had been broken by forces outside their control and had gotten back up because the only other option was staying down. She picked up the ledger again. He put more wood on the fire. That night, when they had all settled and the wind came down off the ridge and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, Eva's hip seized. It happened in the cold. The scar tissue contracted. The muscles around it went tight, and the pain came in slow rolling waves that made sleep impossible. She lay still and breathed and waited for it to pass. She heard the bedroll beside her shift. Lucian sat up in the dark. "Hip? I'm fine. You've been saying that since Cincinnati," she exhaled. "It's the cold." He got up without argument and moved to his pack. She heard him working in the dark, and then a small warmth materialized, a wrapped stone, heated at the fire's edge, wrapped in flannel. He placed it against her hip, with quiet precision. "Hold that there," he said. "The heat loosens the scar tissue." She pressed her hand over the flannel. "Lucian." She said his name, because she wasn't sure how to begin. "The physician in Boston told my former fiancé that the injury had likely compromised my ability to carry children. He said it in front of me while I was still in the bed." She paused. "My fiancé left before the month was out." Lucian was quiet for a moment. "And you've been carrying that like a verdict ever since," he said. "It's a medical fact. It's a possibility. There's a difference." His voice was steady and careful. "The pelvis has remarkable capacity for healing, given the right conditions. I've seen women with injuries far more severe than yours bear children. I've also seen women who healed completely choose lives that had nothing to do with children and live with enormous fullness." He adjusted the flannel against her hip. "What I have never seen is an injury define a person's worth. That determination belongs to the person, not the wound." She stared up at the canvas shelter above her. My fiancé didn't see it that way. Your fiancé was a coward, Lucian said simply, and a fool. And you are in Colorado, building illegal cases to protect a silver claim, managing an assay ledger with 4 pages of notation that would make a professional surveyor envious. A brief pause. I'd say the verdict on your worth came back quite clearly in your favor. The warmth from the stone spread through the scar tissue, and the muscles around it began degree by degree to release. She slept before midnight. The next 4 days on the mountain settled into a pattern that surprised her with its functionality. Garrett organized the extraction work and checked her ledger each evening with the same focused attention as the first time. Lucian maintained the camp, tended her hip each night with the warmth stone and fresh salve, and talked to her in the easy way of someone who had no agenda beyond the conversation itself. Jethro said little, but the little he said was direct and without pretense, and she found she trusted that more than most people's abundance of words. By the time they packed the ore samples and the completed ledger for the descent, Eva had 43 detailed entries, a mineral weight total that would hold up to professional scrutiny, and a clear picture of the vein's active value. She had also, without quite planning it, become necessary, not in the way the mail-order contract had envisioned. Not as a wife, not as a domestic fixture, not as a future mother for a dead man's children. Necessary in the way that a person becomes necessary when they are good at things that matter and willing to show up every day and do them. Garrett held her horse while she mounted on the morning of their descent. "The marshal's office in Denver," he said, handing up her reins. "I'll send a wire when we get back." "Send 2, Eva said. "1 to the marshal and 1 to the Federal Land Registry in Washington. We want a paper trail that Stone can't intercept at the local level." He looked up at her for a moment, the pale winter light coming flat and clean off the snowfield behind her. "Jesse would have liked you," he said. She looked at the mountain, at the high cut, at the stakes with their red flags, at the shaft that had killed a 22-year-old man for the silver running under his feet. "I would have liked him," she said. They rode down. The storm came in from the northwest on the 6th day after their return, which was also the night before Stone's 14-day deadline. Eva had been watching the sky all afternoon. She had grown up with Atlantic weather, which gave warning in its own way, but mountain weather was something different, faster, and more absolute, rolling in over the ridgelines with a speed that left no real time to debate. The clouds came down the peaks like something being poured, and by 4 o'clock the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the first flakes were falling sideways. "It'll be bad tonight," Lucian said at supper. He said it the way he said most things, no drama. Just information. "Then we'll be ready," Garrett said. They spent the hour before dark reinforcing the barn. The livestock represented everything: the horses, the 2 milk cows, the 4 hogs they'd been wintering for spring slaughter. Without them, the homestead couldn't function through another season. Garrett and Jethro packed the gaps in the barn, siding with straw and burlap. Eva moved the feed supply up from the low storage to the main floor, where it could be reached quickly in the dark. She had just carried the last sack when she heard it. Not wind. Wind had a continuous quality, a sustained note. This was intermittent, rhythmic hoofbeats, multiple, coming in from the eastern trail. She stepped out of the barn door and looked. 6 riders, spread wide, coming out of the tree line at a hard canter through the building snow. They wore dark coats and rode with the kind of discipline that wasn't ranch work, too spread out, too deliberate, covering angles rather than ground. She ran. Garrett. She was already moving toward the cabin, cutting across the yard. "Riders, 6 from the east." He was out the door before she finished the sentence. Jethro, right behind him with the rifle, already in hand. Lucian came last, going left without being told, circling around the wood store to get an angle on the approaching men. Then the first firebomb hit the barn. She heard it before she saw it, a crash of breaking glass, then a deep hollow hump, as the kerosene caught the dry straw on the south wall. Fire bloomed orange and violent through the gap in the siding where they had just packed in the burlap. The horses screamed. "The horses!" Eva turned back. Eva, Garrett's voice sharp. But the horses were in there, all four of them, and the cow, and she was already running because the alternative was standing still and watching them burn. She got the barn door open, and the heat came out like a wall, and she went in anyway, pulling her coat up over her face, finding Cora's halter in the dark by memory and grip. The mare fought her. Panicked animals were dangerous, 1,000 pounds of terrified muscle, with no language for trust in a crisis. Eva got her hand through the halter ring and pulled with her whole body and talked at the horse, low and continuous, the same words over and over, nonsense sounds shaped like calm, and after an eternity of perhaps 30 seconds, Cora moved. She got Cora out. Then the second mare. Jethro appeared from nowhere and took both leads from her, and she went back in for the cows. The second firebomb hit the roof. The sound was enormous, a detonation of heat and breaking timber, and the south corner of the barn collapsed inward in a cascade of burning straw and old pine. Eva cleared the door, with the second cow's lead in her hand and the heat on her back, and she stumbled into the yard and went down on one knee. She got up, gunfire now, crackling across the yard from the eastern tree line. She saw Garrett at the cabin corner, returning fire, his left arm pressed against the wall. She saw the dark stain spreading on his right shoulder. He had been hit, but he was still shooting, still controlled, choosing his shots with the deliberate economy of a man who had been in much worse. The snow was coming hard now. Full blizzard, the kind that erased everything past 20 feet, turned the yard into a white void with islands of orange fire. She could hear the mercenaries but not see most of them. The smoke from the barn was mixing with the snow, and the whole world had shrunk to a circle of heat and chaos. She moved toward the corral to get the horses behind the fence and away from the barn fire. She had her hand on the gate when something cold and round pressed against her right temple. She went very still. The man behind her was large. She could feel the mass of him, the arm that came around her from behind and locked across her collarbone. He smelled like kerosene and horses, and something chemical she couldn't name. "Don't," he said. Then another voice from just to her left, and this one was different, calmer. The calm of a man who had never once in his life been told no and been made to accept it. "Miss Vane." She turned her eyes without moving her head. Malachi Stone was not what she had constructed in her imagination. She had built him large, brutish, obvious he was none of those things. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed even now in the middle of a blizzard, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and the pleasant open face of a man who sat on civic committees and donated to church funds and smiled at children. Only the eyes were wrong. They were perfectly empty of anything that wasn't calculation. He stood 3 feet from her in the howling snow with his hands clasped behind his back, and he looked at her the way he probably looked at an inconvenient fence line on a map. "This is a simple matter," he said. He didn't raise his voice above the storm. "The silver deed, signed over before sunrise. The McCords leave the valley by morning, and I never had cause to know any of you existed." He tilted his head. "Resist, and I will burn everything standing, and the woman dies first, and I will still have the deed by morning." The snow came down around them. The barn burned behind her. Garrett's gunfire had stopped. She didn't know if that was tactics or the shoulder, and for a moment, the only sounds were the blizzard and the roaring fire and her own breathing. She looked at Stone. She said nothing. She was thinking, rapidly and precisely, the way she had learned to think when the factory floor flooded and the foreman panicked, and someone had to stay calm and find the valve. Stone needed her alive to deliver the deed. He needed Garrett alive to sign it. That meant the immediate threat was leverage, not execution, which meant there was time. There was time if someone outside this circle was thinking as clearly as she was. She looked past Stone's left shoulder. At the tree line, she could barely see through the snow, at the ridge that ran above the eastern trail, at the dark rock outcropping, where a man with a rifle would have the highest ground and the clearest sightline to the corral gate. She made herself breathe slow. Stone opened his mouth to speak again. The shot came from above and to the east, a single crack through the blizzard that was almost swallowed by the wind before it arrived. The man behind Eva made a terrible sound. His arm dropped from her collarbone. She stepped away fast, turning, and saw him folding to the ground, his gun hand gone wrong at the wrist, not dead, but broken, the revolver in the snow 3 feet from his fingers. Stone spun. From the left, Lucian came out of the white wall of snow with a rifle stock raised. From the right, Garrett appeared at the barn corner with his good arm out, and his gun level and blood dark on his shoulder, and his face absolutely without compromise. And from the ridge above, Jethro McCord was already cycling the lever of his rifle for a second shot. Stone looked at his fallen man. He looked at the 3 McCords closing the distance. He looked at Eva, standing at the corral gate in the snow, and the firelight, her chin up and her hands steady at her sides. He said nothing. "On your knees," Garrett said. The blizzard swallowed the rest. The blizzard didn't care about any of it. It kept coming, steady and indifferent, piling snow against the cabin walls and burying the yard in white. The barn still burned at its south corner, the fire eating itself down now, running out of material. But the smoke and the snow together made a fog that turned everything at the edges of the yard into shapes and suggestions. Eva counted the shapes. 2 mercenaries down in the yard, one from Jethro's shot at the corral, one from Garrett's return fire before the shoulder wound slowed him. Lucian had come around the wood store during the chaos and put the 3rd on the ground with a rifle stock to the temple. That left the lead raider who had surrendered the moment. Garrett's gun came level with his face, and the math became unfavorable. Malachi Stone was a different matter. He had not gone to his knees. He had stood in the snow while they closed around him, with all the self-possession of a man who believed, at a cellular level, that consequences were for other people. Garrett had held his gun on him with his good arm until Jethro came down from the ridge, and when Jethro arrived, Stone looked at him with the polished blankness of a man reviewing an invoice. "You'll regret this," Stone said. "Get inside," Jethro said. They put Stone and the lead raider in Jesse's old room, with Lucian outside the door, which was not a comfortable arrangement for anyone but Held. Now Eva stood in the main room, with the fire stoked high and the situation assembled in front of her. Garrett was in the chair by the table. His coat was off, and his shirt was cut open at the shoulder, and Lucian had come back from the door duty long enough to assess the wound before returning to his post. "Through and through," he'd said. "No bone," which was the best possible version of a bullet wound, but Garrett's face was tight and pale, and he was operating on stubbornness and training, which were reliable fuels, but finite ones. "Let me do it," Eva said. He looked at her. "Lucian showed me the basics 2 nights ago. I've been watching how he works." She was already at the medical kit, finding the carbolic solution, the clean linen strips. "He needs to be at that door. You need this cleaned and packed before the shock wears off. And the pain gets real." Garrett weighed that for exactly 1 second. "All right." She worked carefully. The wound was clean. Lucian had been right about that. And she cleaned it with carbolic, packed it with lint, and bound it tight enough to compress without cutting off circulation. Garrett held still throughout, which she suspected cost him more than he showed. Once, when she pressed into the exit wound to be sure of the packing, his breath came sharp through his nose, and his hand gripped the table edge hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be." His voice was even. "You're doing it right." When she finished, she tied off the bandage and sat back. He was looking at her with that careful, measuring attention she had learned to recognize the look he gave, things he was taking the measure of. "You're steady under fire," he said. "I've had practice." She put the carbolic back in the kit. "Not gunfire, specifically. But things going wrong very quickly. You learn to move first, and be frightened later. That's the only way to survive it. He said it simply, without drama, and she understood that he was speaking from deep experience. 20 years of accumulated catastrophe, compressed into a single practical observation. She had been frightened in Boston, too. In a dozen quieter ways, the factory collapse, the physician's verdict delivered at her bedside, the sound of her fiancé's footsteps leaving the boarding house for the last time. Fear was familiar territory. Moving through it was the skill. Garrett. She looked at him directly. The shot Jethro made, from the ridge through the blizzard, at a target no more than 50 yards from me. He hit the man's wrist. Yes, that was intentional. He wasn't shooting to kill. He never misses what he aims at. Garrett's expression was steady. He chose the wrist. She sat with that for a moment. The image of Jethro, on the ridge, in the dark, in the blizzard, with the wind and the snow, and the distance between his barrel and the man's gun hand, and still choosing a wound over a death, choosing to disarm rather than end. He didn't seem like a man who makes that distinction, she said carefully. He isn't, usually. Garrett shifted his shoulder, testing the bandage. But you were in the circle. And Jethro is very particular about who he protects. From the back room, the lead raider made a sound. Jethro's voice came flat through the door. Sit down. The sound stopped. They held through the night. The blizzard peaked near midnight and began its slow withdrawal by 2 in the morning. Lucian traded door duty with Eva in 2-hour shifts. Garrett slept in the chair rather than the bed, which she understood he wanted to be upright and accessible, not horizontal and helpless. She brought him coffee at 4 in the morning, and he drank it without a word, and she stood beside him for a while, both of them listening to the storm diminish. What do we do with Stone? She asked quietly. We keep him until morning. Then we deal with what we have in daylight. He held the cup in his good hand. The Raider's more useful than Stone right now. Stone won't talk. Men like him have lawyers on retainer, even in their sleep. The Raider might, if we give him the right incentive. What kind of incentive? The difference between a conspiracy charge and a voluntary confession. He looked at the door to the back room. A man who comes forward with evidence and cooperates with federal authorities gets a lesser sentence. A man who stays silent gets whatever the marshal decides he's worth. Most hired guns, when you lay it out that plainly, can do that arithmetic. Eva thought about the ledger in the tin box, about Jesse's careful handwriting on September 11th. If something happens to me, the box is under the floor. We need the signed orders, she said. Not just the confession. Something in writing that puts Stone's name on the instruction. I know. He won't have carried them himself, but the Raider might have them. Garrett was quiet for a moment. He might. Then that's the first conversation of the morning. Garrett looked at her. The fire was low, and the room was warm and gray, and in that light he looked less like the contained, armored man who had met her on the train platform, and more like what he actually was, someone who had been holding enormous weight for a very long time and was not accustomed to having anyone help carry it. Eva, he said, and then he stopped, as though the sentence had arrived before the words for it. She waited. Thank you, he said. For the horses. For the barn. A pause. For all of it. You'd have done the same, yes, but you didn't have to. She thought about that. She had come to Iron Ridge with a 6-month contract and $11.40, and no particular reason to care what happened to the McCord claim beyond its utility to her own survival. At some point, she couldn't locate the exact moment that calculation had changed. The claim mattered now. The cabin mattered. Jesse's journal mattered. The 3 men who had pulled her brace free in the dark and held a lantern steady and cut leather strips and left them on the table, without ceremony, they mattered. I had every reason to, she said, and left it at that. In the morning, when the blizzard had dropped to a hard chill and the yard was blanketed in 3 feet of white, Jethro brought the lead raider out to the table. The man's name was Tate. He was perhaps 40, lean and weathered, with a bruise rising on his left cheekbone where he had met the rifle stock the previous night. He sat with his wrists bound and his eyes moving around the room in a way that was more professional than frightened assessing exits, counting people, doing the math of his situation. Eva put a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. "Drink it," she said. "We're not poisoning you. We need you to talk." He drank. Garrett laid it out plainly, the way he had described the previous night, the difference between cooperation and silence, measured in years of federal sentencing. Tate listened without expression. When Garrett finished, Tate looked at the coffee cup for a while. "There's a ledger," he said finally. "Stone keeps a private account's ledgers, separate from the mining consortium's books. It's got the payments in it, the names, the dates, the amounts. Payments for the Elkins, claim last spring, the Patterson water rights in August, and the McCord shaft in September." He looked up. "I know where he keeps it. His office in Stonewater, third drawer, left of the window, behind the false back." The room was very quiet. Eva reached for her writing supplies. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Everything you know in order. I'm going to write it down, and you're going to sign it." Tate looked at her pen. At the ledger, he nodded. Once, she wrote for an hour. When she was done, she had 12 pages of signed testimony. The names of the men who had cut Jesse McCord's support beams, the date and amount of the payment. The order for the raid on the homestead, delivered verbally, but followed up with a note that Tate had kept. He'd produced it from his inside coat pocket, still folded, addressed in Stone's handwriting on his private stationery. Eva looked at that note for a long time. Then she looked at Jethro. He was standing behind Tate's chair, with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and she could see on his face what Tate's account of the shaft collapse had done to him, the same thing it had done to all three brothers, the confirmation of what they had suspected, but hadn't been able to prove. Jesse had not died in an accident. Jesse had been murdered for a silver claim. Jethro's hand moved to his gun. Tate went still. "Jethro." Garrett's voice was steady across the room. "He was there," Jethro said, low and flat. "He just told us he was there." He was. Garrett stood. He moved around the table, slow and deliberate, and came to stand beside his brother. His wounded shoulder was bandaged under a clean shirt, and his face was pale from blood loss, and he stood there with the full weight of his authority, and his grief, and his conviction. But senseless slaughter makes us no better than Malachi Stone. He waited until Jethro met his eyes. True strength lies in defending this home with justice and honor, not stained blood. The silence stretched. Jethro's jaw worked. His hand stayed on the gun. "Jesse deserves better than this man's death," Garrett said quietly. "He deserves Stone in a federal court. He deserves the record corrected. He deserves a verdict that the whole territory has to acknowledge." A pause. "Give him that. It's worth more than Tate's life, and you know it." Jethro looked at Tate. Then he looked away, out the window at the white yard and the smoldering barn. His hand came off the gun. He walked to the door and stood there with his back to the room, and nobody said anything to him. There was nothing to say. Grief was not an argument to be won, or a wound to be bandaged. It was a weight a person carried, and Jethro McCord had been carrying his for 3 months already, and would carry it longer still. Eva gathered the testimony pages and the signed note, and added them to the tin box with Jesse's journal and the chisel. Then she put on her coat and went out to stand beside Jethro on the porch. The morning was brutally cold and clean. After the blizzard, the sky a hard pale blue, the mountains sharp-edged against it. The burned corner of the barn stood black and ragged against all that white. Jethro didn't look at her. "He made the right call," he said, meaning Garrett. "Yes," Eva said. "I know he did." A long pause. "Knowing doesn't make it easier." "No," she said. "It doesn't." They stood there together in the cold until the coffee was ready inside, and then they went back in. They rode into Stonewater on a Thursday morning, 7 days after the raid. 4 of them, Eva and the 3 brothers, moving down the main street at a deliberate pace that was not a hurry and not a swagger, but something in between. Purposeful. The kind of pace that said, "We have somewhere to be, and what happens when we get there is already decided." Tate rode with his wrists bound to the saddle horn. He had cooperated fully, and he knew the difference between someone who had given their testimony and someone trying to escape, and he was smart enough to be the former. The town noticed them. Stonewater was not a large settlement, a main street, with the necessary infrastructure of frontier commerce, a land office, 2 saloons, a general store, a telegraph post, and a hotel that doubled as the federal way station when circuit officials passed through. The U.S. Federal Marshal's office was using the hotel's ground floor conference room because Marshal Daniel Reeves was mid-circuit through the Colorado Territory and had stopped in Stonewater 3 days prior on other business entirely. Eva had sent the wire before they left. She had worded it with care, physical evidence, and signed testimony regarding premeditated murder and fraudulent foreclosure. Iron Ridge McCord claim, requesting urgent meeting, arriving Thursday. She had not mentioned Stone by name in the wire because she had learned from Jesse's September journal that information sent through Stonewater's telegraph office had a documented history of reaching the wrong people first. Marshal Reeves was waiting. He was a trim man in his late 40s, with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who had spent decades separating fact from performance. He looked at the 4 of them as they came into the conference room, and he looked at Tate, and he looked at the tin box Eva set on the table, and he said nothing for a moment. "Miss Vane?" he said. "Yes, Marshal. Sit down, please." All of you, they sat. Eva had organized the presentation over the previous 3 days with the same methodology she applied to the assay ledger sequence. First, evidence second, corroboration third. She laid it out in exactly that order. Jesse's journal first, open to September 3rd, the chisel beside it with the forge mark facing up, she explained. The forge mark, the private commission process. The fact that MS, initials on a private order tool, pointed to one man in the territory with both the means and the motive. Reeves examined the chisel without touching it. He read the journal entries she indicated, then the testimony. She placed Tate's 12 signed pages in front of the marshal, with a signed note on top. She watched Reeves read the note, and she watched the quality of his attention change, sharpen, and settle. At the same time, the shift of a man who has just seen something that makes a case close around a subject like a fist. "You took this testimony yourself?" Reeves asked. "I wrote it as he spoke it." He signed each page. She gestured to Tate, who sat with the resigned posture of a man who had made his calculation and was committed to it. "He can verify the content and confirm the signature." "I can," Tate said. Reeves set the pages down. He laced his fingers on the table and looked at Garrett, the shoulder wound. "That was from the raid?" "Yes, sir." "And the barn damage? I presume there are witnesses beyond your own household." 3 of Stone's men are still in the valley, Eva said. 2 wounded. They haven't gone anywhere. The blizzard saw to that. Reeves looked at her. It was a look of professional appraisal, the same look Garrett had given her ledger on the mountain, absorbing, checking, trusting the structure of it. "The bogus debt," he said. "There's no corresponding record in the land office." She produced the land office extract she had requested by letter 3 weeks prior, before the raid, when she had first begun building the paper trail. "The claim is registered clean, under Jesse McCord's name. No liens, no encumbrances, no recorded debt instruments." The $400 demand was fabricated. Reeves picked up the extract and read it. Garrett watched him. Jethro sat with his arms crossed and his face controlled, doing what he had agreed to do, which was let the law work. It was costing him. Eva could see it in the set of his jaw, the deliberate stillness of hands that would rather be doing something physical, but he sat. Lucian had said almost nothing since they entered the room. He did not need to. He had brought the signed ledger notation from Tate's testimony and set it beside the medical report he had written, documenting Garrett's wound, Eva's hip injury from the brace, and the condition of the 2 wounded mercenaries they had left under guard at the homestead. His contribution was documentation, and it was thorough. Reeves read for a long time. Nobody rushed him. Finally, he set the last page down and looked at Eva. You planned this presentation? Yes, sir. Including keeping Stone alive and accessible rather than, he glanced at Jethro, rather than the alternatives, Eva said. Yes, that was sound judgment. He stood. I'll need to send a deputy to retrieve the wounded men from your property. I'll want statements from each of you, separately. And I'll need access to Stone's office in this building, specifically the third drawer left of the window. Eva had not told him about the third drawer. She looked at him. Tate's not the first person to know about that ledger, Reeves said simply. He's the first one willing to talk about it on the record. He picked up Stone's signed note from the table. Stone is staying at this hotel. Rented the back suite. A pause, he arrived 2 days before you did. The room went very quiet. He came here directly after the raid, Eva said. Appears so. Probably expecting to file foreclosure paperwork and be done with it before anyone had time to organize a response. Reeves looked at the tin box. He underestimated the timeline. He underestimated the woman, Jethro said. It was the first thing he had said since they sat down. Reeves looked at him, then at Eva, apparently so. They brought Stone in an hour later. Eva did not watch the arrest itself. She stood in the hotel corridor with Lucien while Garrett and Reeves and 2 deputies handled the suite. She heard Stone's voice, still that same polished composure, still the civic committee tone. And then she heard the composure fracture, just slightly, when Reeves read him the charges. Federal conspiracy, fraud, premeditated murder. The fracture was small, a change in register. A single word, impossible, said with the first real emotion she had heard from him, which was not indignation but pure disbelief that the architecture of his impunity had failed to hold. Lucien stood beside her in the corridor and said nothing. After a while he said, Jesse would have wanted to be here for this. I know, Eva said. He wrote in his journal that he was going to fight it, even when he knew they were coming. I read it. He wrote about the bride he'd sent for. Lucien looked at the wall across the corridor. He said he hoped she was the kind of woman who wasn't afraid of hard work or hard winters. Eva was quiet. I think he chose well, Lucien said. She looked at him. His face was in profile, quiet and certain, and he said it the way he said most things, without ornamentation, without strategy, simply because it was true, and truth was worth saying. Thank you, she said. I mean it, Eva. It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss preceding it, and she noticed, and she thought he had noticed too, by the slight pause that followed. They went back into the conference room. Reeves formalized everything. In the afternoon, the bogus debts voided in writing, witnessed and notarized, the fraudulent instrument nullified by federal authority. The Iron Ridge silver claim recorded permanently and unambiguously under the McCord name, all 3 brothers listed, with the provision that the claim could not be challenged, encumbered, or foreclosed upon without direct federal review. Garrett signed the restored deed with his left hand. His right arm in the sling Lucien had fashioned that morning. His handwriting was different with the left hand larger, less certain, but the signature was clear. And the deed was real. He looked at it for a moment before he passed it to Jethro. Jethro looked at it longer. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his inside coat pocket against his chest. And he stood up and went to the window and looked out at the main street of Stonewater for a while with his back to the room. Nobody asked him what he was thinking. They knew. On the ride home, the 4 of them moved at an easy pace through the afternoon cold. The sky was clear, and the snow on the peaks caught the low sun and threw it back in long blue shadows across the valley. It was beautiful in the way that Colorado was always beautiful, large and clean and indifferent to human suffering, the mountains permanent above whatever happened at their feet. Eva rode Cora at the back of the group and let her thoughts settle. Stone was in custody. Jesse's death was on record as murder. The claim was restored. The debt was void. The evidence was with the federal marshal and could not be recalled, hidden, or bought. It was done. She had come to Iron Ridge with $11.40 and a 6-month contract and no expectations beyond survival. She had organized an assay ledger, documented a murder, managed a raid, and delivered a federal case to a U.S. Marshal with enough evidence to make it stick. The 6 months weren't up. She looked at the road ahead. At the three brothers riding in a loose line, Garrett upright, despite the shoulder, Lucian easy in the saddle, Jethro, a dark shape against the white mountain. She had not thought beyond the case. She realized that now, every ounce of her planning and energy had been directed toward Stone, toward justice, toward making Jesse's death mean something in a way the law would recognize. She had not permitted herself to think about what came after. After was here now, riding toward her across a snow-covered valley, and she had no map for it. The cabin came into view as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Garrett reined in his horse and waited for her to come alongside him. "We'll rebuild the barn in spring," he said. "The south wall is salvageable." The frame held. "I know," she said. He looked at the homestead. The cabin with its smoke rising, the ruined barn corner, the repaired fence rails. His land? His brother's. Everything Jesse had been trying to protect. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said. "About what comes next. The contract, the leaving, any of it." He paused. "You've earned more than a rushed decision." She looked at him. "Get home first," he said. "Rest. Let the rest of it wait." She nodded. They rode the last half-mile in the clean, cold air, toward the light in the cabin window, and the mountains standing enormous and solid and permanent at their backs. 3 weeks after Stonewater, Eva packed her carpet bag. She did it methodically, the way she did most things, folded, organized, purposeful. The wool dress first, then the second blouse, then the small leather case with her writing supplies. She had accumulated a few things since arriving. A pair of heavier gloves that Lucian had bought from the general store and left on her wash stand without comment, a length of good ribbon she'd traded mending work for, a small book of Colorado territorial maps she'd found at the bottom of Jesse's tin box. She put the maps in the bag last. The cabin was quiet around her. It was mid-morning, and the brothers were outside. She could hear Garrett directing the first stage of barn reconstruction. Jethro splitting wood at the side of the house with the steady rhythm of a man who needed his hands busy, Lucian somewhere toward the tree line, gathering winter bark for his medicinal stores. She looked at the room, the washstand where Lucian had set the warm stone a dozen nights running, the nail on the wall where she'd hung her brace during the days when her hip needed rest, the window with its view of the mountain, which she had come to recognize in different lights, silver gray before dawn, white and blinding at noon, rose gold. In the late afternoon, she buckled the carpet bag closed. She carried it downstairs and set it by the door. Then she put on her coat and sat at the table and waited, because she was not a woman who left without saying goodbye, and because there were things that needed saying, even if they were difficult to say. She heard the axe stop. Then boots on the porch steps. The door opened. Jethro came in first, the way he always came in, scanning the room in the first second, locating every person, assessing the temperature of things. His eyes went to the carpetbag by the door. He went very still. Garrett came in behind him, sawdust on his coat, and his repaired shoulder moving better now, and he saw the bag and he stopped too. Lucian came last, bark strips bundled under his arm, and he read the room when he stepped through the door, and he set his bundle down quietly on the side table. None of them said anything immediately. Eva stood up from the table. "The 6 months aren't finished," she said, before any of them could speak. "I know that, but what we came here to do is done. Stone is in custody. The claim is restored. The cabin is running. You don't need a housekeeper anymore. You need to rebuild the barn and open the mine properly and get on with your lives." She kept her voice even. "I've done what I came to do. More than what I came to do. And I think it's cleaner for everyone if I go now, while the terms are still clear." She had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it for 3 days. None of them moved from the doorway. Garrett spoke first. "Put the bag down, Eva." Garrett Please? He came into the room fully and stood on the other side of the table from her. His voice was not commanding. It was something else, a request that came from someplace very deep and very deliberate. Let us say what we need to say. She waited. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the care of a man who did not make speeches and knew it, who was doing it anyway because it mattered. You came here as a contract, he said, a name on a document that Jesse picked from a broker's list. And inside of 2 months, you walked into a burning barn, built a federal case from a dead man's journal, managed a gunfight in a blizzard, and held this family together when it was very close to falling apart. He put both hands flat on the table. You are not property. You are not a breeder or an inherited debt. You saved this family from destroying itself. He held her eyes. Stay because you are loved and cherished for who you are. She opened her mouth. I'm not finished, he said, gently but firm. Jethro crossed the room and stopped 2 feet from her. He was not a man who made speeches at all. She had known that from the first night. Whatever he said came out at the cost of something. I know what it is to survive something that was supposed to break you, he said. I know what it is to come out the other side and not recognize yourself, and keep moving anyway, because stopping is worse. He looked at her steadily. You know that too. I saw it the first night you stood in the snow in the yard and didn't step back from my rifle. A pause. I'm not good at many things that don't involve a gun or a fence line. But I know how to stay. I want to stay beside you if you'll have that. Eva pressed her hands together at her waist. Lucian came forward last and stood to her left, and he spoke quietly, the way he always spoke, without drama, without performance. Your pelvis healed imperfectly because you were given no resources and no rest, and no one who treated the injury with adequate care. He said it as a medical fact first, which was his way. It does not define what your body is capable of, and it does not define what your life can hold. I would like to spend the rest of mine finding out what that is, alongside you, if you'll let me. He tilted his head slightly. Your shame over that injury belongs to the people who gave it to you, not to you. Not here. Eva looked at the 3 of them. She had come to Iron Ridge because there was nowhere else to go. She had stayed because there was work to do. She had fought because walking away was not in her nature. And Jesse McCord had deserved justice, and the mountain had needed someone who wasn't too frightened to look at what was under the floorboard. She had not planned to be loved. She had spent so long carrying the weight of what had been taken from her, the factory, the injury, the fiancé who left, the city that had no use for a broken woman, that she had quietly, without noticing it, stopped believing there was anything ahead of her but survival. One season at a time, one contract at a time. Forward, because stopping was worse. As Jethro had said, she looked at the carpetbag by the door. She looked at the window with its view of the mountain. She looked at the 3 men standing in the cabin. They had all, together, fought to keep. She walked to the door and picked up the carpetbag. She carried it back upstairs and set it on the floor of her room and unbuckled it and took out the Colorado map book and put it on the washstand. Then she came back down and put her coat on its hook and went to the stove and put the coffee on because it was cold and they had things to talk about and coffee helped. Nobody in the room said a word, but Jethro sat down. Lucian picked up his bark bundle and began sorting it. Garrett moved to the chair at the head of the table. The coffee started to brew. Winter settled deep into Iron Ridge that night. Snow came down, slow and thick, outside. The heavy kind that blanketed everything in silence. No wind, no howling, just the soft accumulation of white on the roof, and the porch rails and the bare branches of the pine stands. Inside, the stone hearth threw a deep amber heat that reached every corner of the rebuilt cabin. The 4 of them had eaten supper together. Then Garrett had stoked the fire high, and Lucian had brought out the good whiskey, the bottle Jesse had been saving, and they had sat for a long time in the warmth and said things to each other that people sometimes need a fire and a long winter and a shared survival to finally say. Then the brothers had looked at each other and at Eva and something had passed between all four of them, an understanding wordless and clear as mountain air. The past stayed outside. Every verdict that had ever been handed down about Evangeline Vane, by physicians, by fiancés, by factory owners and city gossips, and the particular cruelty of a society that measured women by what their bodies could produce, all of it remained on the other side of the cabin door, buried under 2 feet of Colorado snow. In here, there was only firelight and warmth, and 4 people who had chosen each other on the far side of the hardest months of their lives. Lucian's hands found her first, his healer's hands, careful and knowing, moving across her shoulders and down her arms and speaking a language that had nothing to do with diagnosis. He understood the body not as a machine to be assessed, but as a living thing that remembered everything it had survived and needed to be met with patience. He knew where she carried her tension. He had always known. He dismantled it gently, layer by layer. Garrett came to her other side, his presence large and certain, the steadfast quality of him that she had felt from the first day on the platform, the man who did not flinch and did not leave and did not let go of the things he decided to protect. He cupped her face in his hand. His thumb traced the line of her jaw with the kind of deliberate tenderness that a man of few words pours into his hands because his tongue can't hold it all. Jethro stayed close. Watching her face, he was always watching her face, reading her the way he read tree lines and ridges, looking for the truth of things beneath the surface. When he saw it, what he saw in her, he moved with the directness that was simply his nature. No ceremony, no performance, just presence, fierce and real. She had worn the brace for 3 years, not just the leather and steel beneath her gown, the other brace, the internal one, built from shame and silence and the accumulated weight of being told, in 100 different ways, that she was less than whole, that what had been done to her body was a verdict on her value, that a woman who could not promise a man children had nothing left to promise. She had worn it so long, she had forgotten what she felt like without it. Lucian kissed the old scars on her hip, unhurried, reverent, the way a person acknowledges something that has weathered enormous damage and survived. Garrett held her steady, one hand at her back, his breath warm against her hair. Jethro's fingers traced the line of the scar tissue with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his exterior, and she understood in that moment that fierce people protect hardest what they have decided is irreplaceable. The warmth from the hearth moved through the room like something alive. Pleasure built in her slow and deep, the way heat moves through scar tissue when you finally apply it. Long enough, not sudden, not sharp, but total. It reached places that had been cold for years. It moved through the shame like water, through dry ground, dissolving it, making it simply disappear. She arched, her breath caught. Her hands found Garrett's arm and held. Then it came, the surge of it, overwhelming and unhurried all at once. A trembling that started at the base of her spine and moved outward through every nerve she possessed. She gasped into the firelit dark, her back lifting, her eyes closing. 3 pairs of hands steady and warm against her skin. "Please," she breathed, a sound that was barely a word. "It's rubbing against it." Lucian understood immediately, adjusting the angle of his touch, finding the precise place between sensation and overstimulation, with the attentiveness of a man who had been paying close attention to her body for months. The adjustment sent another wave through her, softer and deeper, and she exhaled long and loose and complete. The fire cracked in the hearth. Nobody rushed. Nobody measured. The night was long and the snow was still falling and they had nowhere to be. But here, later, much later, Eva lay in the amber warmth, with the fire low, and the cabin quiet, and 3 men breathing slow around her. The brace was on the floor. All of her armor was on the floor. She felt the absence of it, the way you feel an old pain, finally let go, not just relief, but the strange lightness of discovering how much weight you had been carrying that you no longer have to carry. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the girl who had stepped off a train at a snowbound platform in a soot-stained navy gown with $11.40, and the rigid conviction that she could survive anything if she was stubborn enough. That girl had been right, and she had gotten more than survival. She had gotten this. The fire settled into coals. The snow kept falling. Eva closed her eyes and slept without her armor. For the first time in 3 years, she did not need it anymore. The snow went quietly. Not all at once. Colorado didn't do anything all at once. It went in stages, the way most worthwhile things changed. First, the south-facing slopes, where the sun hit longest and the rock held heat, then the lower meadows. Then the yard around the cabin, the mud coming up dark and rich underneath as the white retreated. By April, the creek was running. By May, the high cut was accessible again, and the silver mine was operating 12 men from the valley. Fair wages, posted hours, a written agreement that Garrett had drafted and Eva had edited, and every man on the crew had signed. No debt instruments, no predatory loans, no private forge marks on anyone's tools but their own. Lucien had converted the old storage room at the east end of the cabin into a clinic through the winter. By spring, it had proper shelves, proper supplies, and a steady rotation of valley residents who had been making the ride to Stonewater for medical care and were grateful not to have to anymore. He treated injuries, managed fevers, delivered 2 babies before the snow was fully off the ground. He was building something that would outlast all of them, and he knew it. And he worked with the quiet deliberateness of a man building for permanence. Jethro had ridden the valley perimeter twice a week since February. Not paranoia prudence. Stone's arrest had removed the immediate threat, but had not changed the fundamental nature of the territory, which was large and remote, and full of men who respected demonstrated strength above most other things. Jethro was respected. He was also, slowly, recognized. 3 neighboring homesteads had asked him to help train their sons. He had said yes to 2 of them. Garrett ran the mine and the ranch with an efficiency that came from 2 decades of learning to make order out of chaos. He rose before dawn and rarely stopped before dark, and somewhere in the middle of it he had become, without any ceremony or announcement, the kind of man that other men in the valley came to when they needed advice or arbitration or simply a steady voice. Eva ran the books for all of it. The mine ledger, the ranch accounts, the clinic inventory, the wage records, the correspondence with the Federal Land Office in Denver. Her handwriting filled a shelf of record books by May. She had also, with Lucian's assistance, been corresponding with a women's labor reform organization in Chicago that was documenting industrial injury cases across the country. Her letters about the Boston factory collapse had been requested for their formal record. She wrote them at the kitchen table in the early mornings, before the household woke, with the mountain turning pink through the window and the coffee hot and the world very quiet. She was writing one such letter on a Thursday in late May when Garrett sat down across from her with a cup of coffee and 2 mugs and said simply, "Today." She looked up. "Today what?" "Jesse's grave. We've been talking about it since February." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "Spring's here. Time to do it right." She set her pen down. They gathered in the early afternoon, the 4 of them, plus 2 neighbors from the valley who had known Jesse and been asked to witness. The grave was on the eastern slope above the cabin, where the land flattened briefly before rising again to the tree line. Jesse had chosen the spot himself, according to Jethro, for the view it had of the high cut. Eva had spent the previous evening preparing. She had taken the mail-order bride contract from the tin box, the original document, Jesse's signature at the bottom, the broker's seal at the top, and she had folded it carefully. She had taken her old leather and steel hip brace down from the shelf in her room where it had sat unused since January, and she had carried both things down to the yard where the forge fire was banked low. Now she stood at the graveside with both items in her hands. The mountain above them was clear and brilliant in the spring sun. The creek ran audibly somewhere below, and the pine stands were putting out new growth at their tips, the bright yellow-green of things just beginning. Garrett spoke first. He was not a man of ceremony, but he was a man of truth, and the two things overlapped here in a way that made it work. He talked about Jesse, not his death, but his life. The way he had written careful letters to a woman he hadn't met, because he believed a home was worth building. The way he had documented a crime in a journal and hidden it where the right person would find it. The way a 22-year-old man with a silver claim and a plan and a loop on his G had refused to stay quiet even when it cost him everything. Jethro said nothing. He stood at the foot of the grave with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the high cut, and that was sufficient. Jesse knew. Lucian read a short passage from a book on natural medicine that Jesse had borrowed from him and never returned, which made it, Lucian said quietly, the most appropriate thing he owned to read from. Then Eva stepped forward. She held up the brace first. "This kept me upright when I didn't have anything else," she said. "It was necessary for a long time." She paused. "It isn't necessary anymore." She placed it on the forge coals. The leather caught first, curling at the edges, going bright, and then dark. The steel took longer. It heated slowly. The familiar rigid shape, losing definition, going soft at the joints, the buckles releasing without ceremony. She watched it until it was shapeless. Then she placed the contract beside it. The paper went quickly. The broker's seal darkened and vanished. Jesse's signature held for a moment that careful handwriting, the extra loop on the G, and then it too was gone, becoming ash and heat, and the clean smell of something finished. She watched the ashes scatter in the mountain air. "Thank you," she said. Not loudly. She said it to the grave and the mountain and the spring air and the man who had sent for her because he believed in what he was building. "You were right about all of it." Garrett's hand came to her shoulder. Steady. Warm Jethro stood to her left, Lucian to her right. They stood there together for a while, the four of them, while the ashes traveled out over Iron Ridge on the updraft, and the creek ran below and the mine stood open at the high cut, with its crew of 12 working men and its fair wage ledger and its permanent legal status under the McCord name. The handfasting happened at the graveside, which had not been the original plan, but became the only plan that made sense once they were standing there. Garrett had a length of woven leather that Jethro had braided through the winter, not announced, not mentioned, just produced from his coat pocket at the right moment, which was Jethro's way of saying everything he wouldn't otherwise say. They bound their wrists together, one by one, and they made their promises. Not vows borrowed from a church ceremony, not language from a contract or a legal document. Their own words, plain and direct, built from what they actually knew about each other. Now, the brace and the blizzard and the burning barn and the tin box under the floorboard and 12 pages of signed testimony and a warm stone against a scar in the cold dark of a mountain camp. Eva spoke last. "I came here with nothing but a contract and the will to survive," she said. "I found people worth surviving," for she looked at each of them in turn. "That's the whole of it. That's everything." The mountain took the words the way it took everything, without comment, without judgment, simply present and enormous and old. They walked back down to the cabin together. Spring was running ahead of them, through the grass, pushing up green at the edges of the trail, the mud going firm, and the world opening up after the long, white wait of winter. The creek caught the afternoon light. The new barn timbers were pale against the old stone foundation, the wood not yet weathered to gray. Eva walked between Lucian and Jethro with Garrett just ahead, and the mountain stood enormous at her back. And she was not running toward anything or away from anything. She was simply here, on the land, in the light, at the end of the hardest winter and the beginning of everything that came after. That was enough. More than enough it was, she thought. The precise definition of the word.